Okay, welcome to the Chapter 1 review for Math 980. We've had a couple of questions posted to the discussion board, so we'll talk about those. It seems like it's a pretty well understood chapter so far, so that's good to see and good to know. But there are a couple of questions, so let's dive into those. The first one that I saw was about problems with two unknowns. Okay. So, for example, let's say, I don't know, it's always Jill, so let's go Jill. Jill has 20 coins in her pocket, and they are all dimes or quarters. Okay, and if they are all together, she has $3.20. And how many of those are nickels, or sorry, how many of those are dimes and how many of those are quarters, right? So we've seen this problem, we've seen it with nickels and dimes, I think, maybe before. But you do have to think about it a little bit. You can't just go into auto mode on some of these because sometimes they're nickels and quarters, sometimes they're dimes and quarters, dimes and nickels. You have to know how much each of these is worth. A dime is worth 10 cents or $0.1, right? Whereas a quarter is 0.25. Right? Which means, as I'm setting up my equation, I'm going to call, let's say, the number of dimes x. And if I have x dimes, then I have 20 coins altogether, so 20 minus x are the quarters. And if I just take the 10 cents that a dime is worth multiplied by the number of dimes, so 0.1 x, plus the 25 cents, so 0.25 multiplied by the number of them, which is 20 minus x, that should equal the $3.20. Right. If you wanted to, you could multiply everything by 100 to get rid of your decimals, but you don't need to, right? You can work with decimals for the most people can. Most people don't get too scared by the decimals. If you do, just multiply everything by 100 and you'll just have your decimals all moved. Here I'm going to distribute the 0.25. 0.25 times 20 is 5. So this gives me 0.1x plus 5 minus 0.25x. And that second distribution there equals 3.2. Right. Combine my like terms over here, this gives me negative 0.15x when I combine the x terms. Plus 5 equals 3.2. Subtract the 5, right here, this is where autopilot starts to kick in. Subtract the 5, get it out of there. This leaves me with negative 0.15x is equal to negative 1.8. And if you divide each side by negative 0.15, you end up with, I'll write it over here, still on the board I think, yeah. X then is 15, 12. 12. Okay. And since there's 12 then dimes, 20 minus 12, which is 8, there's 8 quarters. So that would be your answer, 12 dimes, 8 quarters. And there we are. So there's an example of two unknowns. The two unknowns are questions like this, or the coffee mixture, right? Joe Blow has a coffee shop, wants to sell a mix of coffee for however much. Or the acid or glucose or whatever it is, mixtures of that stuff. So those are your review, or your two unknown problems. Which there's a couple in the additional problems. If you haven't done those, it might be a good idea to jump into that section's additional problems and work through some of those as well. Let's move on. The next one was about fractions and how to know what to do with these fractions. So let's say that we want to solve for x. And I have, let's say, 1/2 times x minus 2 in parentheses is equal to 3/4 x plus 2. Okay. Now, the lowest common multiple here, the lowest common denominator is 4, right? So if I multiply 4, I have to multiply terms by 4, not every single little thing that appears, right? This whole first thing here is one term. It's a product of 1/2 and this binomial, right? If I didn't have the 1/2, then I have two terms inside this binomial, but because this is multiplied, if I multiply a 4 to this thing, I either multiply it to the outside or distribute it to the inside, but I do not do both. It's one or the other, right? So I'm going to multiply this by 4 on the outside by calling it 4/1. And the reason that this works is by multiplying it on the outside, it essentially is going to get distributed to the inside sooner or later, right? So if I multiply a 4 here and on the inside, what I've done is really multiplied by 16 because there's a 4 hanging out here and I've already thrown a 4 inside. The 4 on the outside comes in anyway, and I've thrown a 16 to the left, not a 4. So that's why you've got to be careful with these. If you don't like this, just distribute your 1/2 and multiply everything by 4, right? So multiply this by 4. These are two different terms, so I'm going to multiply this also by 4. The biggest mistake I see on questions like this is they love to throw in just a whole number and watch you not multiply it by the lowest common multiple, or the lowest common denominator. Because you think, oh, it doesn't need it, it's not a fraction, so let's not worry about it. But we're using the multiplication principle, which says multiply the left side by that number and the right side by that number, and that means everything. So that 2 needs to be multiplied by the 4 as well. Here I'm going to simplify by the 4 and the 2, that leaves me with a 2. And so I end up with 2 on the outside of x minus 2. The 4 cancels here, so I'm just left with 3x. And then plus 8. I can then distribute, right? Autopilot should start kicking in at this point. Distribute, combine like terms, get your x's to one side. This leaves me with 2x minus 4 equals 3x plus 8. Subtract my 2x to bring it to the right, because I can keep my x's positive and just a regular x on the right. And I'll minus 8 to bring all of this to the left. So that gives me negative 12 is equal to x, and I'm done. That's it. I was asked to do a problem from the additional problems for 1.6. And again, if you haven't done the additional problems, it might be a good idea to go back through and do the additional problems. You don't have to do all of them. They're not graded. You don't even have to submit them. You would just look at them if you wanted to. But if you do submit them, it will tell you the correct answers, right? But it's a good way to prepare for this exam. This one says to solve 2 minus x over y plus 1 equals b. And we're solving this for x. This x right here. So the easiest thing to do is to get rid of this 1, because I can just subtract 1 from both sides, get it away from the left-hand side, just treat this whole 2 minus y, or sorry, 2 minus x over y as its own little term for a bit. I have b minus 1 now hanging out over here. And if I want to get this x by itself, the next easiest thing is to multiply both sides by y. And so if I multiply by y, I'm going to multiply this guy by y, left or right, it doesn't matter, right? I end up with that. The y cancels out on the left, leaving me with 2 minus x equals, I'm going to write this as just the y in front. I can't remember how the answer is. Right. I could probably look. But, maybe I'll pull it up. The next thing I want to do is, again, isolate this x, so I'm going to subtract 2 from both sides. And so that just subtracts 2 over there. I'm still left with negative x over here. I'm going to carry this up to the top, so if you need this work, pause the video, because it's going up. So let me just rewrite this. I have 2 minus x equals y times b minus 1. Right. And I'm subtracting 2 from both sides, right? And here we go, clean slate. To isolate this x term, I'm going to subtract 2 from both sides. That still leaves me with negative x. So what do? I have to either multiply or divide by a negative. So I'm just going to throw it all into a negative 1, right? A lot of people like to see it as a multiply, because if you multiply, you can then just see it distribute through. So I'll do that. I'll multiply the left-hand side by negative 1, and I'll multiply the whole right side by negative 1. The negative and the negative just isolate, and I have x now isolated. The negative gets distributed through to this term. And again, be careful with this, because this is indeed a single term, because it's y times that binomial. And so I get negative y times that b minus 1, and then the negative times the negative goes to plus 2. So again, you have to be careful. This negative came to this term and came out in front of the y. It doesn't come to this term in front of the y and then inside here as well, because then you're double dipping on the negatives for this term, right? So this is a valid solution. If you were taking a test where you could write down your answers, you write that, you're good. But we're in a computer system where it says pick the one that's right, right? So none of these are listed there. But if I take this negative instead and just distribute it through here, I can get a y times a negative b plus 1 plus 2, right? And that's also not there. So instead, I'm going to back up one step. Instead of doing that, I'm going to take this whole negative y and distribute it through. So I have negative y times b. I'm just going to put them in alphabetical order, so that's negative by. Negative y times negative 1 should be a plus y. And then I have this plus 2. Right? And this is there in a different order. They have it as y plus 2 minus by, but that's the same thing. Right? And so there we have it. This is the same as y plus 2 minus by. We're just reordering it. That's the same thing, and that's my answer. Okay. Alright, so that was it. That was mostly the questions that were asked. That was all the questions that were asked. I had a couple people say cover chapter 1.8. That was the two unknowns, the very first question we did. So hopefully that gets you going on your way. Hopefully your exam goes well. Take it within the next couple of days, and I will see you guys for the next video. Thanks.